Hi, my name is Monique Raven. I am currently an undergraduate with the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I am an undergraduate at the College of Education. Today, I have the honor of being in the space with Dr. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade. Thank you for being here with me and in Nevada in general today.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. So to ground our conversation, it would be a delight if you could provide us with foundational information about your story. So who you are, what work you most identify with as impactful, and why you're in this work.
Okay. Yeah, so as I said, my name is, or as you said, I guess, my name is Jeff Andrade. I'm a professor of ethnic studies at San Francisco State University and a longtime teacher in my community in East Oakland. I was first, I think maybe in my first or second year, introduced to the work of Paulo Freire by another teacher. And that was the first time I read things about education that actually reflected the kind of teacher that I wanted to be. And it really just sort of opened up a whole world for me of conversations around what at the time was, a lot of people were calling critical pedagogy. And that sort of like, it's 30 years now, right? So that's morphed over time. After that, I think a lot of people started talking about culturally relevant pedagogy, Gloria Letson-Billings' work. And as that has evolved, and I became a researcher practitioner and started trying to describe the kind of pedagogy that we were using in our community, we moved towards conversations of community responsive pedagogy. I think in the last maybe 10 to 15 years, I've actually mostly stopped reading in the field of education because I feel like a lot of the theory and research in that field is it's redundant and it's not particularly focused on what works and why it works and how it works. And when that pivot happened, I started looking a lot more at fields that I think should be much more prominent in education, and particularly in teacher training and teacher development. And that's fields like neuroscience, social epidemiology, public health, really understanding the body and the brain and that dynamic, and what kinds of environments we can create for young people that are responsive to the kinds of conditions that are interrupting their ability to really be their whole selves. And the more that I think I understood those things instinctually as just because of how I grew up and the things that I experienced. But I didn't have the fluency in the language and the research. And so I think in the last 10 to 15 years, that's the stuff that's really been influencing how I think, because it was putting language to what I understood intuitively as a practitioner. And so now, a lot of my work as a teacher and as a scholar and researcher is really focused on the language around wellness and well-being, which brings in a lot of the work that's been going on in ethnic studies around the country. But I think the lens that I've put on it is really more of a kind of medical and wellness lens.
Right. And you've had time too as well, like you said, 30 years. And what's really important is that lived experience that you're able to develop over time just to really hone your attention in, right?
Yeah.
So over the course of your educational career, you developed a philosophy and identity essentially behind Tupac Shakur's popularized poem, The Rose That Grew from Concrete. Could you please guide us in your journey with that initiative, and how inspired you to become a community-embedded educator?
Well, I was influenced by Pac and both his music, but also his poetry, and also his less well-known public speaking and theory of social change, and so I think when I saw that that the young people in my community were also really drawn to Pac's work. It was sort of a natural, right, point of connection that, I mean, I'd been using hip hop in my English literature classroom for like as long as I could remember, right? And not just hip hop. Like I would have students bring in whatever kind of music they were interested in, right? And we would do a lot of literary analysis of the lyric, and then connect that, right? Use that as a kind of scaffold or a bridge to some of the literary canon that they might not otherwise be interested in. But when we could, you know, identify similar themes, right? And they could start comparing, you know, let's say Nas's The Message to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's, right, work. They would actually suddenly be sort of interested in Coleridge, at least to the degree to which they could have Nas speaking to him, right? So, but I think what has sort of been the persistent and consistent theme around Pac's work is really the metaphor of the rose that grew from concrete, because it really does, I think, in a number of ways explain the reality of the material conditions that young people are living in and growing in, and if we really do see young people as these metaphorical flowers, right, that we're growing, I think that Pac's metaphor really helps us understand what the challenge is that we're up against, right? And that it's not about just growing one rose, right? If we want a rose garden, then you can't have a rose garden in concrete, right? You can have an individual rose that finds its way through the cracks, right, to make it to the sun. But if we want a rose garden, we've got to figure out how to break up the concrete, right? And that's really what started drawing me to these other fields, is really trying to understand what happens to someone that grows in concrete, right? What does it do to their body, right? What does it do to their spirit? What does it do to their emotions? And then what kind of spaces can we create for young people that are experiencing that to be more well, right? And to have the space to process, because they know it's wrong, right? They know what's happening in their lives is wrong. But I think a lot of young people, and this, I would include myself in this group when I was young, you just felt like it's just how it is, you know? And you don't see it as unnatural. You see it as that's how life is.
Right.
And I think the more that you start to see, actually, it doesn't have to be this way, because it can be this way, that starts to generate different kinds of questions in your mind and different kinds of possibilities in your mind. And so that's why I really value that metaphor, because it's true, right? It is describing in some ways the essence of the kind of spaces that young people are experiencing. And it's also, while being truthful and direct, it's also hopeful, right? Because the rose is finding its way, right, through the crack. And then how we evaluate that, right, and what we see as our responsibility as teachers in that metaphor really shaped the way that, or I think really exemplified the kind of teacher that I wanted to become.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's amazing. So speaking of hope, in your book, Equality or Equity Toward a Community Responsive Education, you really inspired me and created a lot of emotions for me during the read. This includes heartache, anger, frustration, but also hope. As you've highlighted throughout the novel, the book, hope is a transformative force that humanizes our dreams, fortifies our goals, and strengthens our resilience to face obstacles and setbacks. Hope is especially crucial for children. In your book, you introduce two sound archetypes, being a hope dealer and a dope dealer, and you also talked about that during your talk as well. Could you explain the distinction between the two and dive deeper into what it means for educators to embody the role of a hope dealer for their students?
Yeah, so I think that binary, the dope dealer, and the term hope dealer actually was, I don't know if it was coined, but the way I was introduced to that term was actually by one of my students, whose name is Tiffany Marie. She longtime teacher, and then still is a teacher, but then followed a similar path, got her PhD, and is now a university professor, working with youth in the community, but also teaching teachers. And she created this apparel line called Hope Dealer. So all these hoodies and shirts, right? And she, was talking to me and saying that's how I see you, right? You're a hope dealer. And then I started reflecting on that. It's like, okay, well, if I'm a hope dealer, right? If the things that I'm trying to do as a teacher, right, I'm about dealing hope, right? What would be the kind of antithesis of that, right? And then so I started playing around with this idea of the dope dealer, right? And of course people's minds like immediately go to, the cat on the corner that's like, selling dime bags or whatever. And I kind of want that, right? Because it's like that's how you're thinking about the dope that's like the drugs that are like negatively impacting our kids. But that's not what I actually see. Like when I see like a dope dealer, right? Somebody on the corner, right? I don't see like a pariah, right? I see the result of a failed society, right? And so I'm not going to blame that person. Like, yeah, like everybody's like responsible for their own choices, of course, right? But to not acknowledge that those choices are sort of heaped onto so many of our young people because of the way that we've structured our society, because of the way we've structured schools, and the overwhelming majority of them would never choose that life, right? If they felt like they had viable, right, other options. And so, yeah, if you have all these viable options for yourself and you choose that life, then I think there's a different kind of accountability there for you, right? But I'm not going to hold the least powerful people accountable until we hold the most powerful people accountable, right? And that's not really how this society works, right? It's like the gavel's always pounding down, right, instead of pounding up. So when I talk about dope dealers, that's not who I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about this society, right? And people that support the status quo and the norm in this society that has created the most unequal of any of the developed democracies in the world, right? We are, so this is the 70th anniversary of Brown, which is, was our Supreme Court's statement and commitment to creating an equal education system, which we all know is pomp and circumstance. Like, worst kept secret in the country is how radically unequal, right, our school systems are. But it's the law, right? I mean, you can't go any higher in terms of like, law or policy than the Supreme Court. So, but we've said that we want an equal education system, while at the same time, right, producing the most unequal society in the world. And so the only way that you like pull that off, and when you really think about it, like if you actually look at the data, the level of inequality in this country is stunning, right? Most people have never really seen the public health data, right? They've never really seen the economic data. And you feel it, right? But when you really look at the data, I mean, it is absolutely stunning that we do not have total social unrest. And, I was trained in sociology for a long time, right? And so, so I do like see the world oftentimes through a sociological lens. And for my money, the reason that explains that, like in all other places where you see this kind of incredible inequality, there is massive social unrest, right? but not here. Like, there's peace on the streets, like, all the time, right? Relative, right, peace on the streets. And I think that's because of schools. I think that the United States learned from other radically unequal and inequitable societies that if you leave the masses to their devices, there's going to become a point where it's like, fuck it.
Right.
Like, I'm going to die anyway, right? So I'm going to revolt, right? And, you know, every empire in the history of the world has fallen. And every empire in the history of the world has fallen for the same three reasons, which is an untenable gap between the rich and the poor, a massive percentage of everyday people either incarcerated or enslaved, right, and then some major social event that lit the match, right? We're just missing that. I mean, we have the largest wealth gap in the history of the industrialized world right now in the United States, and it's growing. It's not shrinking. It's getting bigger, right? The gap between the rich and the poor. Right. And we have the highest percentage of our population incarcerated in the entire world. So, but then in a lot of these other empire, you know, colonizer societies, they did not send everyday people to school, right? They were locked out of that because that was seen as, right, for the rich, right, for the landowners. The U.S. is the first empire to decide that they were going to give everybody, right, school. And it was designed from its outset to be a project of domestication for working people, for immigrant people. Right? They literally called them Americanization schools. They weren't called U.S. public schools, right? They were called Americanization schools. We know very well from our history that we did this to indigenous people, right? They took their children away from their families, boarded them, right? And now we're finding that we were killing them there, right? And burying the bodies, disappearing children, right? So this is part of the legacy of the foundation of schools. It was never designed, like if you really look at the history of public schools, that project was never designed to create a pluralistic, multiracial democracy that was equitable, ever, right? It was designed to maintain power inequalities. And so that's dealing dope, right? The only way you can do that, right, is to pacify people. Right? Because if they really like zoom out and look at the society, they would revolt. Right? Because there's nothing in the water that suggests this is changing anytime soon. So why don't they? Because they go to school. Right? And they get this narrative that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can, right, have Vegas, right? You can have, and that's dope, right? That's why people take dope. Right? They take the literal drugs, right, of dope to numb themselves to their pain. Right. And the reason that people end up doing that is because of what doesn't happen in schools, right? You end up on the corner buying a dime bag because of what hasn't happened for you in school. And so I want to look at the first dope dealer that led the person to the dope dealer on the corner, because that's the antidote, right? That's where we're going to stop numbing ourselves and start transforming our society. And that antidote is hope, right? So the antidote to that dope dealer, the dope dealer that is repressing our conversations about the kind of society that we could be. That's the person that is interrupting that is, as my student said, is a hope dealer.
Thank you for that, yes. And it's especially interesting how you acknowledge the importance of history, so we in the end don't repeat what we continue to see, right? In your book, Equality or Equity, you emphasize history as a form of medicine and wisdom for students. What is the value of integrating individual students and whole community history into education so we could prevent things like those pipelines that you acknowledge?
Yeah, so I mean, one of my favorite Malcolm X quotes is he said that of all the forms of study, the one that's most likely to reward your efforts, because you're wearing a Malcolm shirt.
The connection.
Yeah, of all the forms of study, the one that's most likely to reward your efforts is the study of history, because the truth is always lying there, right? And if you really study the history of public schools in this country, and then you walk into schools, it all makes so much more sense, right? Because schools are doing exactly what they're designed to do. And if we want things to be radically different, right, for so many children, right, that are not doing well in school, then we have to do things radically differently, right? So it's a bit of a like false marker or false narrative, right, that we're really committed to, seeing poor and working class kids and kids of color do well in school, because that will not happen unless school is wildly different than it currently is.
Right.
And I think that the way that you come to understand that is by studying history, right? Mm-hmm. The example I often use, and I think I use this in the book, is, I'll ask people when I'm doing a keynote, I'll ask them, how many of you own a home? And some cross-section of them will raise their hands, and I say, okay, when you first bought your home, or when you were getting ready to buy your home, what was the first thing you had inspected? And of course, everybody says the foundation. And I say, well, why not the double pane windows or the HVAC system or the state-of-the-art kitchen or the roof, right? Why the foundation? And the obvious answer is because, well, if I have all those other nice things, but I don't have a good foundation, it's all going to fall in on itself anyway. That's kind of how I think about schools, right? Like, we keep throwing good money after bad because we're putting double pane windows into a rotten foundation. Mm-hmm. And we keep pulling our hair out trying to understand, like, why isn't this making kids read better, and because the foundation's rotten, right? And for me, the foundation, if you back to your question, if you look at history, right, then you can see the cracks in the foundation. You're like, oh, okay. And so then you got to do foundational work, right? Before you start buying the latest, greatest reading curriculum or, Eureka Math or whatever it is, just calm down, right? Because there is no evidence, zero, and I mean this literally, there is zero evidence that those investments transform student engagement and achievement over time. Zero. Right? There, you can give me anecdotal stories, right? Oh, this student loved Eureka Math, right? Or this student loved, what's the literacy curriculum you're using now in your?
HMH.
They love HMH, right? It doesn't even matter what HMH stands for, right? It's just right? They're going to have those stories to prop up, right, this narrative. But I already know, right? This is my life's work. I already know what the outcomes of HMH are going to be, because there's no foundational work being done, right? And so HMH is going to fall in on itself. And then some other textbook company, Pearson, right, Macmillan, somebody else will come up with, DVA, right? And then every districts will throw all kinds of money at that. And it's just going down this sinkhole. But if we stop, right, and we look at the foundation question, the foundational question is, for what? For what? Why do we take children from their families by law for 7 hours a day for 13 consecutive years in this country? Why are we doing that? Okay. And if you tell me that it's to create college to career pathways or a more advanced technological workforce, carry on. If you tell me that you're doing that because you want the children in this society to be more well, then we got major foundational work to do. Because no school in the country is measuring the well-being of the children that they serve. Not like they're measuring reading. Angela Duckworth author of the widely used but poorly conceptualized book, Grit. And I really respect Angela a lot because she challenges her own thinking when her thinking gets challenged. And so we've had some interesting exchanges, but she told me once, she says, we measure what we treasure. So if you look at what schools measure, that tells you what they treasure.
Right.
And they don't treasure the well-being of children. So if we want a healthy community, if we want a well community, that's going to begin with the kind of habits we build into our children in our schools. Mm-hmm. And you can point your fingers at neighborhoods and you can point your fingers at families all you want. The research is very clear about this. Children spend more time in school than they do in any other institution, including the family.
Right.
So we cannot deny, I'm not saying the family doesn't have responsibility. I'm not saying social media doesn't have some responsibility. I'm not saying coaches don't have some responsibility on sports teams. I'm saying that the single most powerful institution in the development of children in the United States of America is school.
Right.
And so if we want to change the outcomes for our children, we got to change the foundation where we're doing the major institutional work. And for me, the answer to that, the for what question, the answer to the for what question is wellness. That I want public schools in this country to make a singular promise to me as a parent. And that promise is that at the end of the day, when you come back to pick up your child, that they will be more well than when you drop them off. Because we had 7 hours with them. And that's measurable, right? Mm-hmm. That we can data drive that, right? We can look at a child's wellness score and track that over time and know to the degree to which we are actually producing, right, that outcome for children. We also know in all of the pediatric science, all of the neuroscience, all of the physiological science, that well-being is the precondition to doing well in school. Mm-hmm. The kids who struggle the most in school are the least well. The kids who do the best in school are often, not always, but often the most well. So if we're talking about schools being research-based and data-driven, then they should be.
Right.
And the research is very clear about this, right? That's where you really develop strong students, right? Is in their well-being. Right. If we want to be data-driven, then we have to have metrics that are actually giving us data feedback on the degree to which we're accomplishing that goal. Mm-hmm. Until we do that work, that foundational work, then we're not really understanding what history is telling us. So we'll repeat, which is what happened. So you're entering the profession 30 years after me. And if you looked at the data, student outcome data from when I started 30 years ago, and you look at student outcome data from your first year teaching, guess what?
Nothing's changed.
It looks exactly the same.
Right.
Same kids are struggling.
Well, that wraps up our interview. I want to thank you again, Dr. Andrade, for coming and being present with me in the space and answering some of my questions. And yeah, thank you for watching and good job. Yes, good job us.
Thank you.